This video is on lesson 4.7 in our book called Real World Problems, Multiplying and Dividing with Fractions. We're on page 200. We're going to look at what to do if we have a word problem and how to solve it. The problem on that page says, a vendor at the farmer's market has 240 pieces of fruit. She sells half of it to one customer and a third of it to another customer. We have two questions, part A and part B here. Part A asks, how many pieces of fruit does the vendor sell? And part B asks, how many pieces of fruit does she have left? So now we know we're working with a whole, and we have parts of the whole. So keep in mind, she sells half to one customer, a third to another customer, and then how much does she have left? That's what part B asks. So here's our whole, and right away we're splitting it up into three different parts. We have what was, or you could say two parts. These two parts are what were sold, and this part is how much fruit is left. So we need to identify how much was sold and how much is left, and that's how we're going to break down our whole. Now our fractions are a half and a third. Do you remember what we need to do when we have two fractions that are not like? So half and a third are not like fractions. They have different denominators. How are we going to compare to the two? How can we say a half of the fruits went to this person and a third of the fruits went to this person? You need to make it easy on yourself. If you were to draw a model of this problem, it should not be out of two parts, because then you would only represent the first customer that got half. It should not be out of three parts, because then you would only represent the second customer that had a third. How can you represent both customers? You need to find the least common denominator, and that would be 6. So 2 times 3 is 6, 3 times 2 is 6, and this is why our model is going to be out of 6 units or 6 pieces. Now here's my model representing 6 units, and these 6 units all represent 240 pieces of fruit. That's how much she had, and then she sold half of them to one customer and a third of them to another customer. So half of my model, half of my units, went to one customer. Can I say that 3 out of 6 pieces is half? Yes, 3 units out of my total of 6 units represents half of the number of fruits. So that's how much went to one customer. What is 1/3 of 6 units? What is 1/3 of 6? Here, what's your operation? It's going to be 1/3 times 6 over 1, because a whole number. How do you represent it as a fraction? You just put it over 1. Multiply normally, you end up with 6 over 3. What's 6 divided by 3? It's 2. So how many units does the second customer buy? 2. 2 units out of 6. This would represent your third. So far I know that half of my units went to the first customer. A third of my units went to my other customer. We're working with a total of 240 pieces of fruit, remember. So here I represented half as being 3 units and a third as being 2 units. Now 3 units representing my half of the fruits that went to the first customer, 2 units represent the third of the fruits that went to the second customer, and the last unit is representing what is left. So this last piece represents what's the amount of fruits that are left. Now write out your information to make it easy for yourself and so that you don't forget any part of the problem. What does this model show? Write it all out. It shows me that 6 units equals how much fruits? Equals 240 pieces of fruit. And then it shows me that means if 6 units is 140, that means 1 unit must be worth 240 divided by 6, which is 40 pieces of fruit. 5 units, why am I saying 5? Because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is the amount of fruit that was sold. Part A of the question just asks how many pieces of fruit does the vendor sell. It doesn't ask how many pieces went to the first customer and how many went to the second customer. It just asks how many was sold in total. That means you're going to answer the question of how many pieces of fruit went to both the first customer and the second customer. That's why we're going to count all 5 of those units, the units that were sold, and that must be 5 times 40, which is 200 pieces of fruit. So your answer for part A is 200. The vendor sells 200 pieces of fruit. Now part B asks, how many pieces of fruit does she have left? You have 1 unit left here. And did we agree that 1 unit is 40 pieces of fruit? That means your answer for part B, part A is 200 pieces of fruit, remember? Your answer for part B is 40 pieces of fruit left. That's how much she has left. So that was the first method of doing that problem using models. The other method you could have done this is convert your fractions to having like denominators. So remember we said the least common multiple of 2 and 3 because we're working with a half and a third, remember? One customer got half of the fruits, the other customer got a third of the fruits. What's the least common multiple of 2 and 3? It's 6. How can you take half to have the denominator of 6? You're going to multiply numerator and denominator by 3. 1 times 3 gives you 3. And 2 times 3 gives you 6. So a half becomes 3 over 6. And our fraction of a third becomes 2 over 6. Why? You're going to multiply 3 times 2 to get 6. And you're going to multiply 1 times 2, the numerator, same thing. You'll end up with 2 over 6. Now, how much of the fruit was sold? Can you add these two fractions now that they have a common denominator? Yes, now they're like fractions. And you can easily add 3 over 6 plus 2 over 6. And this is how you can find out how much fruit was sold. And you can answer part A of the question. You do your addition normally. 3 plus 2 is 5 over 6. This is our fraction. 5/6 of the fruits were sold. Now we know the total number of fruits. It's 240 pieces of fruit. So if I ask you, what is 5/6 of 240? Your order of operations, your operation is, what is it going to be? It's going to be multiplication. You're going to do 5/6 times 240. And how do you do that? 5 over 6 times 240 over 1. Remember whole numbers. To make them fractions, in order for you to be able to multiply, you just put it over 1 because 240 divided by 1 is 240. If you do your multiplication, you will get 200. If you do 5 times 240 over 6 times 1, you will end up with the answer of 200. So you'll answer for A, part A, will still be the same as what we got when we did the model. 200 pieces of fruit is how much she sells. Now, if that's how much you know how much she sells, and you know that her total that she started off with was 240, to answer part B, how much was left, all you have to do is what you started off with, which is 240, minus how much what was sold, and you'll get your answer again for part B, which is 40. She had 240 pieces of fruit, she sold 200, she was left with 40 pieces of fruit. The third method you could have answered this problem in is, if your first customer you sold them half of the fruits, and remember you started off with 240 pieces of fruit. What's half of 240? It's going to be half times 240. Half of 240 is the same as half times 240. Half times 240 over 1, so you could do your multiplication. 240 divided by 2 is 120. So the first customer got 120 pieces of fruit. The second customer, they got a third of the fruits. They got a third of 240. So your operation is multiplication once again. You're going to do a third of 240, which is a third times 240. If you do your multiplication, you'll get 80. Basically, 240 divided by 3. You're going to add these two numbers together. How much was sold? That's what part A is asking, remember? You're going to add 120 plus 80, and you'll end up with the same answer. You'll end up with 200. So the vendor sells 200 pieces of fruit. Part B asks how much was left. If she started off with 240 pieces of fruit and she sold 200, how much is left? 40. Same answer. Now please go ahead and do guided learning number 1 on page 201. That's page 201. Guided learning number 1. The problem says, Kim has 48 plants in her garden. Of the 48 plants, 2/3 are carrots and 1/4 are tomatoes. The rest of the plants are pumpkins. How many pumpkin plants are in the garden? Now this question doesn't have a part A, doesn't have a part B. It doesn't ask you more than one question. It gives you some information, and if there's only one question, how many pumpkin plants are in the garden? It's not concerned with the carrots or the tomatoes.